Why did the disciples suddenly speak in tongues in Acts chapter 2? And why is it that we are paying a lot of attention to that very moment? It addresses the fracture that happened at Babel. At Babel, one language leads to confusion, and then at Pentecost, many languages and different languages lead to understanding. If you don't know me, my name is Elias. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I'm a professor of philosophy. I'm also a Bible scholar. I try to connect the geography with the theology, or as I put it, to connect the words of the Bible with the places of the Bible. Okay, so first, let us set up the scene. When the Holy Spirit descends on the disciples, they are gathered in the upper room. It's also the place where the disciples had their last supper with Jesus. It's a place that I have visited many times. For me, it's associated with instruction, with anticipation, and even transition. As we read in Acts chapter 2, after the Holy Spirit descends on the disciples, they begin to speak in tongues. There is a sequence that's happening. I have divided this into 5 steps. Most people just stop at step number 4. So if you follow the text carefully, step number 5 is the step that we need to highlight and focus on. And so I'm not asking here so much what kind of tongues were these. I'm asking what does the text emphasize, and as I see it, it's emphasizing hearing. For example, if you read the book of Acts chapter 2 verse 6, it tells us that when they started speaking in tongues, each one was hearing them in his own language. You also see the same thing in verse 8, which talks about how they're understanding it in their own native language. If you take those verses, you will notice that the emphasis is not on speech, but rather on the hearing. They heard it. And the key point here is that the speech is structured around understanding. And so when you focus on the shared experience of understanding, that tells me that something deliberate is taking place. For the purpose of textual analysis, what I want to do is to look at instances where the issue of language would have been mentioned but also focused on. And so for us to be able to understand this in our day today, we have to go backwards. I say this because a lot of us are raised on the New Testament. We're not so familiar with the Old Testament. And so what we need to do is to go back to the Old Testament and begin to identify the very places where we see a mention of languages and how that is going to work with our interpretation of it when it comes to the New Testament. Now, you have to keep in mind the disciples and people who lived in the first century didn't really have to do any of that because back then they only had one testament. We call it the Old Testament, but for them it was the only testament. And so they would have been very well versed. They would have even memorized the Old Testament, and they would have caught the echoes and understood what Jesus was doing and how that connects to an earlier episode that's mentioned in the text. In fact, if you move to the book of Genesis, in particular Genesis chapter 11, the text describes the Tower of Babel. It talks about how humanity was unified, how they spoke a singular language, a common language that everybody understood. And then it talks about their effort in terms of building this tower, the Tower of Babel. The idea is that they want to be able to ascend to the heavens. And in so many ways, they want to grab what they believe is rightfully theirs. Of course, as we continue reading, the response we get is very striking because if we follow this, it tells us that God descends. And what he does is that he divides the language. With the division of language comes confusion. And what that leads to is fragmentation. People scatter, forming their own nations, becoming separated. So now let's return to the book of Acts chapter 2. There's a movement, but this time it's not upwards. In fact, the text emphasizes the downward movement. So it's not humanity reaching upwards towards the heavens, but it's rather God coming downwards to meet his people. But this time, unlike Genesis, the situation is different because you didn't have a unified people. You had people who spoke different languages, had different cultures, came from different backgrounds, and had different ethnicities. And so here let's focus on language. There isn't one, there are many languages. Instead of confusion, we get understanding. So the situation that we saw in Genesis is now reversed. It doesn't aim to remove differences, but what the Holy Spirit does is that in spite of our differences, we are able to understand the gospel. We are able to understand the message of the Lord because meaning can be shared across differences. If you enjoyed this analysis, like, comment, and subscribe. I have a lot more stuff that's coming your way.